Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Harry Potter world remains, unsurprisingly, magic itself, and all the tricks wizards use to hide their existence from Muggles. Over the centuries, they've developed dozens, if not hundreds, of ways to keep magical details hidden from ordinary people. In the books and films, we see that only a tiny circle of Muggles knows the truth. Yet throughout 7 books and 8 movies, events keep happening that stay unnoticed almost by miracle, even though logically, Muggles should have figured it out long ago. Let's take a closer look at these moments. Enjoy watching. Number 1. The Escaped Snake. The reader's first encounter with Harry's magic happens at the zoo. Harry talks to a snake and accidentally makes the glass vanish, setting it free. People at the zoo were shocked. They saw a boy inside the enclosure and the glass disappear. But what happened next? There's no sign of Ministry of Magic staff wiping memories. All those people must have had some very unpleasant questions afterward, or at the very least, there should have been newspaper stories about the miraculous reptile escape. Number 2. Platform 9, 3-4. The passage to the magical platform at London's King's Cross station is a classic concealment trick. Wizards just walk through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Yes, the Ministry claims it monitors the area and wipes the memories of accidental witnesses, but the Hogwarts Express departs in the middle of the day when the station is packed. Muggles would surely notice strange groups of children vanishing one after another, especially at such busy times. No matter how good the Ministry's staff are, it seems impossible to avoid all such slip-ups in a crowd. Number 3. The Ministry of Magic entrance. One of the strangest ways to access the Ministry is through a public toilet. Wizards enter stalls, activate a mechanism, and literally get flushed in. It seems Muggles should have noticed that dozens of people go into the bathroom but never come out. Even if Ministry employees monitor the place, it's hard to believe that over all these years, no Muggle ever picked up on anything odd, especially in the busy centre of London. Number 4. Aunt Marge. The scene in Prisoner of Azkaban where Harry loses his temper and inflates Marge Dursley ends surprisingly quietly. They deflated her, wiped her memory, Harry wasn't punished, and he calmly returned to Hogwarts. But even if the Ministry arrived very quickly and handled all witnesses, someone in Little Whinging might have noticed a woman screaming and floating in the sky. At the very least, rumours about an inflated Marge should have spread around the neighbourhood. Number 5. The Night Bus. In the books, it's explained that Muggles can't see this purple triple-decker bus. Great cover, right? But in the movies, it looked much more chaotic. The night bus barrels along, reshaping streets with crashes and bangs, knocking things aside. Despite its invisibility, it physically affects the Muggle world. Even if no one sees it, it's hard to believe no one hears or notices the aftermath of its visit. Number 6. Apparition. One of the fastest ways to travel is apparition. A wizard vanishes in one spot and instantly reappears somewhere else. Perfect for an escape, but terrible for secrecy. In the films, this is especially striking. Remember the Golden Trio escaping Bill and Fleur's wedding by apparating right onto a busy street, appearing in front of a crowd. Even if the Ministry can wipe memories quickly, these kinds of incidents must have happened before, and it would be impossible to fully control them. Number 7. Owls on Privet Drive. One of the most memorable scenes in the first film is hundreds of owls crowding the Dursleys' house to deliver Harry's letter. Even if Muggles didn't immediately think of magic, it would have looked extremely strange. So many birds arriving one after another would obviously raise questions among the neighbours, even the most oblivious ones, but in the books and movies, the Muggle surroundings act as if they didn't notice at all. Number 8. The Quidditch World Cup. The Quidditch World Cup was a spectacle no Muggle festival could match. Thousands of witches and wizards crowded the countryside in tents that defied physics. In Goblet of Fire, Rowling writes, some of the tents had chimneys, some had several stories. The Roberts family managed the campground, completely bewildered by guests in robes and pointed hats. Even with memory charms, it is hard to believe they didn't mention it to a single neighbour. When the Death Eaters attacked, flames roared into the sky. Tents blazed like torches, screams echoed for miles. The book says, "The dark mark burned in the sky, green and glittering, with a skull and serpent." Anyone in the nearby village of Ottery St. Catchpole could have seen the emerald glow and panicked, yet somehow no local newspaper carried a word about a riot that lit the night and sent thousands fleeing in terror. Number 9, The Flying Ford, Anglia. Harry and Ron soared above the countryside in the battered turquoise Ford Anglia. The car rattled and groaned, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. In Chamber of Secrets, rolling rights, they were over a patchwork of fields and hedges. They weren't flying over deserted moors. They crossed busy roads, villages and train lines. Imagine a lorry driver on the M1 glancing up to see a car puttering through the clouds, or a family having breakfast in their garden, pointing at the strange shape buzzing across the sunrise. They crashed straight into the Whomping Willow on Hogwarts grounds, dented and dazed. The Ministry of Magic likely scrambled to modify memories, but how many people did they miss? A single photo in the Daily Mail would have destroyed the statute of secrecy. Colin Creevey would have loved snapping that shot. And there's something darkly funny about Arthur Weasley, who enchanted the car in the first place, reading a headline, "Flying Ford Causes Panic Over Oxfordshire." Number 10. Dementor Attacks. In Order of the Phoenix, 2 Dementors attacked Harry and Dudley in the narrow alley behind Magnolia Crescent. Rowling describes it in chilling detail. All the happiness drained out of him. The world went cold. He felt as though he would never be cheerful again. Even if Dementors are invisible to Muggles, their effect is not. The temperature dropped so sharply that Harry saw his breath. Frost crusted the ground in the middle of August. Imagine the neighbours on Privet Drive, watching summer vanish in seconds. Curtains would twitch, someone would shout to their kids to come inside, lights would switch on along the street as people peered out, seeing 2 boys staggering through freezing mist. Petunia Dursley might have dropped her gardening shears in fright if she'd seen them crawl back to number 4, pale and shaking. It is impossible to believe no one noticed the fog rolling in under the street lamps or felt the despair seep into their bones. The Ministry did send Mafalda Hopkirk's letter about underage magic, proving they knew instantly what had happened. But how many other residents needed their memories modified that night? Little Whinging was a tidy, watchful suburb. Yet the books never mention a single neighbour pounding on the door to ask why Harry and Dudley looked half dead. It is as if the whole street simply chose to forget that summer turned to winter in a heartbeat. Number 11. Weasley Twins' Magical Fireworks. Fred and George Weasley were artists of chaos. In Order of the Phoenix, they set off a fireworks display so powerful it shut down exams and drove Dolores Umbridge screaming from the hall. Rowling writes, dragons comprised entirely of green and gold sparks soared through the air, emitting loud bangs and screeches. These weren't simple sparks in a classroom. The fireworks shot high above the castle towers. They roared and crackled like thunder, visible for miles around. Hogsmeade was just down the road. Anyone sipping butterbeer at the Hog's Head would have seen serpents of fire twisting across the sky. Even in the Muggle villages further away, farmers looking out over their fields at night might have seen the glow reflected on clouds. Sparks shaped like spinning Catherine wheels danced in the air, hissing curses at Umbridge in giant letters. It's hard to imagine any nearby inhabitant ignoring such a show. The Weasleys' prank was meant to humiliate a teacher, but it lit up half of Scotland. The Forbidden Forest must have echoed with the blasts, frightening centaurs and birds alike. If a Muggle hiker had been camping on a nearby hill, he might have thought the world was ending, yet the Ministry of Magic seems to have wiped every memory clean. No one filed a police report about a flaming dragon screaming abuse in the night sky. Number 12. The Battle of Hogwarts. The Battle of Hogwarts was no quiet skirmish. It shook the very foundations of the castle. Stone towers crumbled, fiendfire roared like a living serpent through corridors. In Deathly Hallows, Rowling writes, a giant lunged, swinging its club through a window, sending shards flying. The Forbidden Forest erupted with the clash of centaurs and acromantulas. Explosions rattled the hills. Anyone in Hogsmeade would have heard the booming thunder of spells. Lights like fireworks lit the night sky in sickly green and brilliant red. It was a war visible for miles. Villagers in Hogsmeade surely felt the ground shudder. Aberforth Dumbledore stood in the Hog's Head, watching the chaos from his door, but even he couldn't keep every curious eye away. Rosmerta's pub sat on the main street, with windows that faced the castle's outline on the hill. Imagine locals pressing their faces to the glass as curses exploded in the dark. The Dementors were driven off with a mass Patronus so bright it could have been mistaken for a new moon rising. How did no Muggle wander up the road or call the police when the entire horizon seemed aflame? After the battle, Hogwarts was in ruins. Stone walls collapsed into courtyards. Great chunks of the viaduct crashed into the ravine. Yet somehow the Ministry convinced everyone nearby that it was fine. No one asked why dozens of injured teenagers limped through Hogsmeade at dawn. No one questioned why the air smelled of smoke and blood. It is one of the greatest mysteries of the wizarding world that such an epic battle could rage so close to Muggle Britain and leave not even a rumour behind. Number 13, number 12, Grimmauld Place. Number 12. Grimmauld Place was no ordinary townhouse on a quiet London street. It was hidden between numbers 11 and 13 by the Fidelius charm, its secrets locked inside the mind of Albus Dumbledore. But even with this magic, the place was alive with movement. Members of the Order of the Phoenix arrived at all hours, slipping through the front door and vanishing into thin air for anyone watching. In Order of the Phoenix, Rowling writes, the houses on either side of it were squeezing it out of sight, closing together so that there was no door, no windows, no house at all. Yet people still gathered on the steps, murmured passwords, and vanished. Imagine the neighbours peeking through lace curtains. They would see figures in heavy cloaks on summer nights, grim-faced and whispering. Mrs. Weasley, Sirius Black himself, even Mad-Eye Moody with his electric blue eye constantly swivelling. Muggles might have caught a glimpse of Moody glaring straight through their walls. In one tense moment, Tonks tripped over the umbrella stand with a crash loud enough to wake the street. Harry heard the deafening clatter that echoed through the house. Surely that sound would carry through the thin Victorian walls. Meetings were not polite tea parties. The Order discussed Voldemort's return in raised, angry voices, Sirius shouting, Lupin arguing, Molly Weasley weeping. Harry remembers. He could hear the shouting in the drawing room below. Even if the Fidelius charm kept the house hidden, soundproofing wasn't perfect. London flats are notorious for their paper-thin walls. The neighbours must have heard the noise and wondered what kind of family feud raged behind that crumbling facade. Consider the final days of Sirius Black himself. He lurked behind the curtains like a ghost, restless and bitter. Sirius was staring at the tapestry as though deeply lost in thought, Rowling says. Yet he would peer outside, watching for visitors pacing the hall. Neighbours might have glimpsed a pale face at the window, someone who had been declared a mass murderer in every wizard paper. It is hard to believe that no one in that street ever noticed anything strange at number 12. Number 14, escape from Gringotts on a dragon. Harry, Hermione and Ron didn't just break into Gringotts, they tore the wizarding world's oldest bank apart from the inside, escaping on the back of an enormous half-blind dragon. Rowling describes it with brutal clarity. The dragon roared and smashed at the glass dome above. Debris fell as goblins screamed. The trio clung to the beast's ragged scales, its chains clattering while it blasted through the roof in a shower of glass and gold. It was no small tremor in the heart of London's magical district. It was a thunderclap. Above the city, the dragon's wings spread wide. It flew over the rooftops, smoke curling from its nostrils, an ancient terror made real. London isn't a deserted moor. It's the city of Big Ben and black cabs, lined with cameras at every corner. Tourists fill Trafalgar Square. Commuters cross the Thames on crowded bridges. Are we to believe no one saw a white, scarred dragon screaming through the dawn light? The wizarding world loves to talk about obliviators, but that many witnesses, that many phones, it would be a public relations apocalypse. Think of Hermione herself, her knuckles white around the dragon's spine, shouting over the wind. Harry's glasses cracked. Ron yelled back. They weren't stealthy, they weren't careful. Rowling writes, they were clinging to the dragon, who did not seem to know or care where it was going. It careened over the countryside, then the river, a living nightmare in chains. Imagine the chaos below, police sirens, news choppers lifting off, Londoners flooding social media with blurry photos of claws and wings. And yet, in the wizarding world, there's silence. No mention of newspapers shrieking about monsters over London, no hint of Muggle authorities reacting to a giant reptile crashing through the airspace. It's a hole in the secrecy of magic so big you could fly a dragon through it. It asks us to believe in magic not just to hide a monster, but to erase the memory of a city that watched it burn through the dawn. Number 15, Triwizard Tournament Visitors. The Triwizard Tournament, as depicted in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, was a spectacle so grand it drew attention from across Europe. Wizards from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang travelled to Hogwarts to watch their champions compete. These arrivals, described vividly by J.K. Rowling, Madame Maxime towering over everyone, Karkaroff's stern, predatory glare, brought an international air to an otherwise secluded school. Yet the entire event took place in the Scottish Highlands on British soil, in a castle surrounded by Muggle lands. How did hundreds of foreign witches and wizards slip through unnoticed? Local villagers surely saw the sudden rush of cloaked travellers, the strange carriages drawn by winged horses, and the sinister Durmstrang ship breaking the surface of the lake. The book mentions that the arrival of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang was a great spectacle, but it never explores the question of who might have been watching from a distance. The surrounding Muggle villages near Hogwarts are small, quiet places, used to foggy hills and lonely paths, but a sudden spike in travellers should have raised suspicions. Hundreds of witches and wizards would have needed food, lodging on the way, or even simple directions from local Muggles. Imagine the innkeepers in Hogsmeade. Even if that village is wizarding, its suppliers are not entirely cut off from Muggle Britain. Crates of food, barrels of butterbeer, and imported goods would have surged in demand. Nearby Muggle businesses would have noticed supply shortages or unexplained delays. Even if the ministry used memory charms, there is a limit how often they can intervene without it becoming suspicious in itself. Rowling writes Hogsmeade, the only all-wizarding village in Britain, lay close by, suggesting its closeness to the Muggle world. One wonders how many Muggles were simply told to forget the lines of foreigners buying odd groceries and speaking in foreign accents. Consider the very geography of Hogwarts, described as an ancient castle by a lake and forbidden forest with a train station that has to connect to the rest of Britain. The Hogwarts Express itself is hidden via a special platform in King's Cross, but foreign delegations would not all use that route. Madame Maxime's carriage is drawn by giant winged horses. In the book, Rowling writes, the Beauxbatons carriage was as large as a house. That's not exactly inconspicuous. How did the ministry hide a house-sized flying carriage as it traversed the skies of rural England and Scotland? It would have taken extraordinary magical coordination. Perhaps they used disillusionment charms or illusions, but there is no mention of this in the book. One is left to imagine Muggle farmers watching in horror as a gigantic blue carriage thundered overhead. Even the Durmstrang ship raises questions. Rowling describes its arrival. The lake had turned choppy and frothy, and then out of the water rose a great black ship. The magic of its sudden surfacing is impressive, but where did it come from? Did it sail invisibly up the North Sea, dodging ferries and shipping lanes? Even if it surfaced only at Hogwarts, the delegation must have landed somewhere in Britain first. They did not teleport from Bulgaria straight into the lake. They needed to travel over Muggle land. Did dozens of cloaked Bulgarians just appear in a coastal village and hire carriages? The book offers no detail on how they avoided alarming Muggle port authorities. One imagines customs officers trying to search the hold of a ship, only to be confounded into forgetting the entire vessel. The Ministry of Magic had a department specifically for such issues, the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Their job was to handle breaches of secrecy, but the scale of this event dwarfed any routine obliviation effort. Hundreds of foreigners, all with wands, many with little knowledge of British Muggle habits, would have produced a spike in magical incidents. Even with a team of obliviators working around the clock, they would struggle to catch every slip. In the book, Arthur Weasley explains that wizards sometimes forget to dress like Muggles, showing up in kilts and galoshes in London. How much worse would this be with French and Bulgarian? Wizards? Beauxbatons students with their silken uniforms, Durmstrang with furs and battle boots roaming the countryside. Local police would have noticed and gossip would have spread quickly. Think about the security checks at airports, train stations and ports. Wizards are famously bad at dealing with these. Rowling makes it clear that wizards consider Muggle technology baffling or beneath them. In Goblet of Fire, wizards attending the Quidditch World Cup had enormous trouble blending in. Arthur Weasley had to explain to his fellow wizards why wearing a nightgown in public was a problem. If the Ministry had trouble containing the chaos at the World Cup campsite, which was remote and designed for secrecy, how much harder would it have been to manage 2 entire international schools? Arriving in Britain. The book never tells us if the Ministry rented entire trains or booked out ferry crossings to keep Muggles away. It just glosses over it. There is also the question of local rumour. Even if memory charms worked on individuals, they could not suppress gossip entirely. Imagine a Scottish postman noticing dozens of cloaked figures appearing at dawn, or a local child seeing giant winged horses from afar and telling school friends. A single photograph, grainy, out of focus, could have launched headlines in the Muggle press about UFOs or cults. Rowling's world suggests the International Statute of Secrecy is fragile, enforced largely through intimidation and hasty obliviation. In Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry threatened to expel Harry for performing a Patronus charm in front of Dudley, even though Dementors attacked first. If they took such a hard line with a teenager, how could they allow such large-scale gatherings to proceed without leaks? Number 16. Enchanted Underground and Portals. In the damp, echoing tunnels of the London Underground, where the screech of trains and the smell of iron and wet stone make even the bravest pause, there are places that don't exist on any map. The books tell us that witches and wizards slip away unseen, using secret portals and doorways that magics conceal from Muggle eyes. But the question lingers like thick fog on a November morning. How is it possible no one has ever noticed? When Arthur Weasley bumbled through the ticket barriers with Harry in Order of the Phoenix, he didn't even know how to swipe his Oyster card, and Harry noted that Arthur's fascination with Muggle travel made them stand out. The scene plays out with amusement, but the truth behind it is far more unsettling. Because if Arthur Weasley, a senior Ministry wizard, could barely pass for normal, how many others must have fumbled, stammered, or flat-out vanished before startled Muggle commuters? In the books, Harry and Mr. Weasley ride the Underground with little problem, but it's clear neither belongs there. "Now, Harry, you must understand how fascinating this is to me," Arthur said, trying to press every button he could see. Yet no one seemed to notice them or care. The author suggests a kind of collective blindness, but doesn't bother to question its limits. When they finally reached the ministry's visitor entrance, in the phone box, they had to speak a passcode, an absurdly public act in the middle of London. How did no one see a teenager and a red-headed man vanish into a telephone booth that sank into the ground? In the age of smartphones, where tourists film every oddity, one would expect at least a blurry YouTube clip, a Reddit thread, a single tabloid headline, but there is nothing. The very architecture of the wizarding world depends on Muggle neglect, but it is hard to imagine that neglect remaining absolute. Imagine an exhausted banker late at night on the Northern Line, sitting across from a witch with emerald green robes poking out of her overcoat. She stands abruptly, strides to the far wall, and disappears into it. Even if the ministry casts charms of disillusionment or Muggle repelling, spells, they must be imperfect. Arthur Weasley couldn't even tie a Muggle tie properly. Is it so hard to believe that someone might have slipped, that the magic might have glitched, even for a moment, letting a Muggle see the impossible? One famous example never mentioned in the books would be the Chancery Lane station, rumoured among wizards to contain a hidden entrance to the Department of Mysteries. The platform itself is often eerily deserted after midnight. Aurors use it as a backdoor to avoid detection, vanishing into walls marked with the faintest runes. The place feels off even to Muggles, who avoid the last carriage at night, mumbling about cold draughts and the sense of being watched. There's an old woman named Hester who sells the Evening Standard outside the station. She once told a neighbour about the strange lot who would slip past her, ignoring her calls, eyes glazed. She died before anyone could ask her more. The wizarding community claimed no responsibility, but one wonders how many Hesters there are in London, noticing just a little too much. Consider, too, that in Half-Blood Prince, Harry follows Draco into Nocturne Alley by spying on him in Borgin and Burke's. Draco is sloppy, paranoid, but careless, proof that even trained wizards make mistakes under pressure. When he later uses the Vanishing Cabinet to ferry Death Eaters into Hogwarts, he relies on a portal hidden in plain sight. These magical doors don't advertise themselves, but neither are they invulnerable. In the same way, there must be wizarding portals in the underground that no one thinks to check, because they are simply assumed to be closed tunnels, staff areas, or locked service corridors. But that presumes Muggles never get curious, never hop barriers or peer through gaps in the wall. It's absurd. Urban explorers crawl through abandoned tube stations with cameras and flashlights. Could the Ministry really obliviate them all? Obliviate, of course, is the Ministry's answer to everything. Gilderoy Lockhart boasted of it, proudly telling Harry and Ron that he had wiped memories so well his victims didn't even suspect they'd been cursed. But obliviation is not perfect. When Hermione modified her parents' memories to forget her entirely, it was a deeply moral and traumatic act, one that showed memory was fragile but resistant. The books acknowledge that memories can be recovered or imperfectly altered. Would a wizard hit by a train of Muggles recording on smartphones really have time to track down every witness, seize every phone, and erase every backup? It strains belief. Even the wizarding world can't control the cloud. The author J.K. Rowling describes magic as needing intent and skill. Not every witch or wizard is a master. In the Ministry, lower-level workers are often incompetent. Perkins in Arthur's office couldn't remember half his assignments. One shudders to think who maintains the secrecy of wizarding portals in the tube. Imagine a frazzled intern late for work, dashing through a wall while a carriage full of city workers stares. Even if they're obliviated, that doesn't explain the lost CCTV footage. London's transit system is famously dense with cameras. Surely someone would have noticed gaps, odd interference, people melting into walls. Yet the books never acknowledge this. It's as if they hope you won't ask. Number 17, Shops of Diagon Alley. Hagrid's vast bulk was impossible to ignore as he led Harry through the London crowds toward the Leaky Cauldron, a pub wedged between a record shop and a big booked office front. Rowling describes it in Philosopher's Stone as a tiny, grubby-looking pub that most Londoners never seemed to notice. But it was right there, on Charing Cross Road, a stone's throw from busy pedestrian crossings, cafes full of tourists, and black cabs idling at the curb. It is hard to believe that no one, not a single sharp-eyed Londoner, ever wandered in and saw the most startling thing of all, someone tapping the bricks of the back courtyard until they swung aside and revealed a crowded magical bazaar bustling with cloaked shoppers and owls in cages. It seems all too neat to claim that the Leaky Cauldron's magic kept Muggles away when it remained a licensed establishment serving ales and pies in central London. The text itself says it is open to them. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Fudge puts Harry there for a few weeks before term, and the boy sits in the common room with a few curious-looking characters, but no mention that all were wizards. Rowling implies it is a rougher sort of London pub, the kind with old smoke stains on the ceiling, but not invisible to Muggle eyes. A random tourist in 1990s London could easily have pushed open that door on a whim, only to witness Hagrid thumping the bricks and a stone wall parting like a stage curtain. Imagine an American backpacker stumbling inside on a rainy afternoon, ordering a pint, then noticing the giant of a man leading a scrawny, bespectacled boy into the back. A sudden commotion of bricks rattling aside would catch anyone's attention. Even if the entrance to Diagon Alley slammed shut immediately after them, the sight of an ancient wall splitting open would be unforgettable. It is the sort of thing that should have landed in a weird news section of the Evening Standard. Tourist claims wall opened in central London pub. Instead, Rowling's world depends on the idea that Muggles are too blind, too forgetful, or too dismissive to notice real magic in front of their eyes. Consider the detail in Philosopher's Stone where Harry is amazed by the transformation. The brick he had touched quivered, it wriggled in the middle, and a small hole appeared. It grew wider and wider. A second later they were facing an archway, wide enough even for Hagrid. This is not subtle magic. The wall literally disassembles itself in broad daylight. Any Muggle in the courtyard, or even glimpsing from the pub's back door, would see it unfold. If you claim the pub itself was warded so only wizards could see the bricks move, you contradict the book's description that the pub is open to anyone and that Harry, a total newcomer, sees it all without special training or bloodline protection. Even the wizards inside the Leaky Cauldron did not hide what they were. They wore cloaks, talked about cauldrons and goblins, and raised tankards to salute Hagrid. Philosopher's Stone states, "The old woman with a pipe clapped him on the back." Harry was confused, yes, but a normal Muggle visitor would have been utterly gobsmacked by a bar full of characters who seemed ripped from an Arthurian legend. So many eccentric London places thrive on this sort of oddity. Think of tourist blogs about witchy shops in Soho or Ye Olde Mitre Tavern hidden in alleys. The Leaky Cauldron would have been an Instagram sensation decades before Instagram was invented. Then there's the geography of Diagon Alley itself. Once you're through the brick wall, it is described as a winding, bustling street lined with shops selling pewter cauldrons, spellbooks, broomsticks, and magical pets. Harry sees a sign hanging over the shop selling cauldrons of all sizes, shop windows crammed with spell ingredients. It is an entire shopping district, like a covered arcade in Victorian London, only for magic. Even if you claim the ward slammed shut behind each visitor, someone standing in the courtyard would see the entire portal gaping wide while shoppers moved in and out. The idea that no curious local or drunken vagrant ever noticed is hard to swallow. The wizarding world's only explanation seems to be mass enchantment and memory charms, but the books don't consistently show these measures in place at the Leaky Cauldron. Rowling writes about the Ministry modifying memories in catastrophic slip-ups like the time a dragon flew over Britain in Goblet of Fire, but she never mentions a squad on standby to obliterate memories of tourists who popped into the wrong pub. Order of the Phoenix describes the Ministry's Obliviator headquarters But those witches and wizards are not standing in the leaky cauldron's back room with wands at the ready. It feels like a glaring oversight for a government obsessed with secrecy. Tom the barman is a hunchbacked, toothless fellow who greets Hagrid like an old friend. He's a fixture of magical London, but also the pub's muggle-facing host. He would have had to deal with tourists, wandering vagrants, and bored students from nearby universities. Can one old man truly keep the secret alone? If a bachelor party from Liverpool stumbled in and demanded pints, would he hex them into forgetting? Nothing in the text says so. Rowling seems to rely on the idea that Muggles don't notice things, but in real life they notice plenty, especially if it's this strange. Number 18, Street Duels in London. In the turmoil of Voldemort's second rise to power, London was not a quiet city sheltering from distant danger. It was a battlefield where magic erupted into the Muggle world with terrifying force. On one particular night, the air over Charing Cross Road crackled with spells as members of the Order of the Phoenix clashed with Death Eaters in a duel so fierce it shattered windows and overturned cars. The book alludes to these chaotic engagements in Deathly Hallows, where there was a flash of green light in the sky, and Harry and Hagrid are pursued through the streets. Yet somehow the Muggle newspapers never printed stories of men in masks throwing curses that split pavement. The official explanation rests on the Ministry's memory charms, but it is difficult to accept they could have covered every camera feed, every driver caught in a traffic jam, every bystander peering from behind a lamppost. There is something darkly comical about picturing Kingsley Shacklebolt or Arthur Weasley hurriedly waving their wands at terrified Londoners. These Ministry officials were stretched thin across Britain, battling Voldemort's influence while simultaneously trying to hush up the evidence of his followers' atrocities. It strains credulity that obliviators could move quickly enough to edit hours of CCTV footage or calm crowds fleeing in panic. The Death Eaters were not subtle about their intentions, reveling in terror. They sent the dark mark over Brockdale Bridge and destroyed Millennium Bridge, both events mentioned in the series as collapses explained away to Muggles as structural failures. Yet magic leaves traces more difficult to explain than a falling bridge. Even a single stray stupefy in a city street would draw crowds, journalists, police. The confrontation between Death Eaters and Order members above Tottenham Court Road, when Hermione, Harry and Ron flee there in Deathly Hallows, offers a clear example of magical combat spilling into public spaces. The trio apparates into the cafe, is attacked immediately, and tables are smashed, a waitress screams, and the memory of it all is simply wiped away. J.K. Rowling writes, Hermione raised her wand and said, "Obliviate." And that was the end of it for the Muggles, but this was only one. Corner of the War. What of other duels, simultaneous fights in alleys and squares where the Order tried to contain attacks on prominent Muggle-borns? Magical combat is loud, bright, violent, stupefying bursts of red light, green killing curses, shields that deflect spells like battering rams, none of which could plausibly go unnoticed in a major city. It is tempting to believe the Statute of Secrecy was a sturdy barrier, but Voldemort's campaign broke every rule the Ministry once enforced. Death Eaters wanted fear, and fear among Muggles suited them. When they launched attacks on the Ministry itself, using Polyjuice Potion to infiltrate it, the chaos spilled over into London streets. Aurors pursued them, firing curses in broad daylight, and it is naive to imagine no Muggle ever caught these strange flashes on their phone cameras or through car windows. In an era where even the smallest protests or celebrity sightings are filmed and shared, the idea that magic went unseen seems like a fragile fantasy propped up by the Ministry's desperate spin. Consider the night the 7 Potters fled Privet Drive, the sky over Britain lit up with spellfire. Hagrid's motorbike roared through London's highways while Death Eaters gave chase on broomsticks. Harry himself described seeing jets of green light and dodging them as Hagrid shouted at him to hold on. Rowling writes they hurtled through the air, narrowly missing a church spire. Even if the Obliviators worked overnight, How did they erase the shock of drivers who nearly crashed seeing two men on a flying motorcycle? Battling dark wizards in the clouds. The Ministry's apparatus for secrecy was never designed for such open warfare. It is even more implausible when considering Muggle infrastructure. London is one of the most surveilled cities on Earth, even by the late 1990s when these events were set. CCTV cameras recorded countless corners, doorways and streets. Imagine a duel in which Antonin Dolohov hurls a curse that blasts through a storefront window, shattering glass onto the pavement. He was among Voldemort's most savage lieutenants, described as broad and brutal-looking, with a taste for destructive curses. It is hard to see him quietly waiting for an obliviator before fleeing the scene. Even a single camera catching him in his black robes, mask askew, screaming incantations in Latin would have been enough to sow rumours of witchcraft impossible to stamp out completely. We can picture scenes of London police responding to calls about gunshots or explosions, only to arrive at blasted doorways without bullets, just smoking holes that seem to defy physics. Forensic investigators might find residues that make no sense, metal warped as if by invisible heat, bodies with no apparent wounds but eyes wide in terror. Even the best obliviators could not be everywhere at once. The idea that all these events left no trace on Muggle records, no half-remembered stories, whispered among police or paramedics, seems absurd. In Half-Blood Prince, we are told that Muggles noticed the collapse of Brockdale Bridge and the weird weather that followed Voldemort's return. The Prime Minister is informed that these events are magical in origin, and Scrimgeour tries to reassure him that the Ministry is doing everything it can. Yet this is also an admission that the barrier between the magical and Muggle worlds was fraying. Voldemort was not subtle. His entire strategy depended on fear, and if that fear spread to Muggles, so much the better. To imagine that he refrained from open dueling in Muggle spaces is to ignore the text itself, which repeatedly shows him attacking public targets without hesitation. Rowling's narrative implies that obliviators were overworked, racing from scene to scene with wands outstretched. Picture a team of them at dawn, trudging along Whitehall, waving wands at passers-by who gawked at cratered streets or scorched bus stops. The Statute of Secrecy is an old law built for isolated incidents, a stray hex here, a vanished hippogriff there. It was never meant to mop up after war. When Voldemort's supporters wanted to kill or capture Muggle-borns, they didn't limit themselves to Nocturne Alley. They hunted them in Muggle neighbourhoods, dragging victims screaming through suburban parks or snatching them from crowded streets. Even if they obliviated direct witnesses, news of the missing wouldn't simply vanish. One might even question the reliability of memory charms themselves. In Chamber of Secrets, Gilderoy Lockhart's backfiring charm shows they can be unstable. Even a skilled obliviator risks erasing too much, leaving people catatonic or suspicious of lost time. Multiply this risk by hundreds or thousands of urban encounters and the idea of perfect secrecy collapses. There would be Muggles who woke up days later and wondered why they had no memory of Saturday night. Others might see scorch marks on walls and refuse to believe gas main explosion excuses. Think too of the media. Even if the Daily Prophet lied to wizarding readers, Muggle newspapers wouldn't fall in line. Editors would be flooded with tips. I saw a man fly. There was green fire in the sky. A guy in a black cloak shot sparks at a cop. Even if obliviators silenced eyewitnesses, they couldn't intercept every grainy photo or video. By the 90s, tabloid journalism thrived on sensationalism. Imagine the Daily Mirror headline, "London Witch War, Spooky Sky Explosions Puzzle Police." The Ministry would have to work overtime to kill those stories, bribing editors, hacking offices, and leaving even more evidence of a conspiracy. The chaos of the Battle of the Seven Potters alone would have seeded conspiracy theories. Hagrid's bike tearing over rooftops with Voldemort in pursuit. Rowling writes that Harry felt the sidecar shudder as another curse missed them by inches. That is not something you simply erase from every mind in Greater London. Children would have pointed and shouted, drivers would have swerved, some would have crashed. Obliviators can't repair cracked ribs. or fix insurance claims with a flick of a wand. And what of the Death Eaters themselves? Fenrir Greyback was known for attacking Muggles, specifically to spread terror and lycanthropy. Bellatrix Lestrange, psychotic, even by Death Eater standards, wouldn't care who saw her throw a killing curse on a crowded street. When the text says they spread terror throughout the country, it doesn't limit this to wizarding spaces. These were public attacks meant to break the Ministry's control and cow Muggleborns into submission. The Statute of Secrecy was a noble idea forged in a time when wizards numbered fewer and could hide more easily. Voldemort's war turned Britain into a land of fear, with the magical and Muggle worlds crashing together. The books themselves admit the truth when they show us the collapse of bridges, the murder of Amelia Bones, a high-ranking Ministry official, in her own Muggle neighbourhood, the infiltration of the Ministry. If the magical world truly stayed hidden from Muggles during this open war, it was not because secrecy was easy, but because the Ministry used desperate, brutal, and ultimately flawed methods to try to hold back the truth. In the end, what Rowling describes is a government teetering on the edge, barely containing a civil war that spilled onto London's pavements and rooftops. The Statute of Secrecy was never designed to hide an urban insurgency fought with killing curses and flying motorbikes. The Muggles might not have understood what they saw, but to suggest they saw nothing at all is the real magic trick, and one that reveals as much about the fragility of the wizarding world as any spell ever cast. Number 19. Giants in Britain. Few moments in the Harry Potter saga raise as many uncomfortable questions as the unexplained invisibility of the giants who rallied to Voldemort's banner. When Hagrid returned from his perilous diplomatic mission in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, readers were told that the giants, those colossal beings with hands the size of dustbin lids, had been persuaded to join the Death Eaters. The books hint that these creatures were deployed to sow terror and destruction across Britain. Yet J.K. Rowling never describes any significant reaction from the Muggle world, even though the mere passage of a giant herd should have turned entire villages into archaeological curiosities. It seems inconceivable that no Muggle historian or journalist ever stumbled upon a freshly crushed cottage or a grove of trees snapped like toothpicks. According to Hagrid's account, they smashed up most of the mountainside on their way back down. This detail alone suggests how impossible it would have been to conceal them if they moved beyond their hidden enclaves. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Voldemort's forces escalate their attacks on wizarding and Muggle targets alike. There are mentions of bridges collapsing, deaths blamed on accidents, and unexplained disappearances, yet no mention is made of what one might expect when giants, often over 20 feet tall, roam across the countryside. Their sheer size would have left behind monumental footprints, each the depth of a bathtub. Even if giants walked mostly by night, it is improbable that every farm dog, motorist and rural postman failed to notice the dark silhouettes lurching across open fields. The British Isles are a land of narrow roads, dry stone walls and centuries-old farmhouses. It strains credulity that giants could traverse such landscapes without even a flicker of curiosity appearing on the front page of the Times. The Scottish Highlands, often described as remote and uninhabited, have hikers, shepherds and researchers combing the hills year-round. During the time the giants were allied with Voldemort, several attacks on Muggle infrastructure occurred, such as the collapse of the Brockdale Bridge. Yet nothing in the record indicates any unusual seismic disturbances or reports of creatures resembling enormous humanoids. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it is said that Hagrid narrowly escaped capture after hiding from Death Eaters. Hagrid's own words, "They set the giants on us," imply that these monsters were unleashed in the chaos following the fall of the Ministry. One can only imagine the titanic footfalls vibrating through the heather and shaking loose the stones of old crofters' cottages, and yet not a single Muggle journalist from the BBC appears to have driven north in search of answers. Some readers have speculated that the Ministry of Magic must have dispatched teams of obliviators to wipe the memories of thousands of witnesses, but even the most powerful memory charms cannot repair the physical evidence: the trampled hedgerows, the scorched forests, the barns reduced to splinters. One wonders how the Statute of Secrecy Enforcement Squad, often depicted as overstretched and inept, could possibly erase every scrap of proof. Perhaps the most striking example is found in the chapter The Battle of Hogwarts. As Voldemort's forces besieged the castle, several giants are described swinging their clubs, smashing through stone walls as if they were paper. The narrative focuses on the wizards' desperate defense, but it never pauses to consider what the rest of Britain must have witnessed: a midnight thunder of inhuman shapes towering over the hills. No less puzzling is the question of transportation. Giants do not apparate. They must have walked, or at best been transported in convoys that would have made any ministry operation impossible to conceal. In the Scottish countryside, where sheep outnumber humans, even a single tank is difficult to hide from view. Yet we are to believe that an entire troop of giants could trudge south without igniting a single phone call to the police or an article in the Daily Mail. There are old roads through the Cairngorms and Grampians, lined with villages and hamlets whose residents would surely have noticed whole tracts of forest pressed flat overnight. Hagrid himself offers clues to the violence that accompanied the giant's allegiance to Voldemort. In Order of the Phoenix, he describes Carcass, the Gurg, being killed by Golgamath. After Golgamath took charge, the giants began accepting gifts of human bones and dark artifacts. This suggests they were already conditioned to see violence as a means of diplomacy. It is not difficult to imagine the terrifying aftermath of a hungry, impatient giant straying into a Muggle farm in search of fresh meat or warmth. Even if the Ministry of Magic were able to cast concealment charms over a single site of destruction, repeated incidents across months of war should have left a trail of unsolvable mysteries. Consider the likely impact on local police forces. In rural Wales or Northumberland, a flattened barn would immediately trigger speculation about rogue demolition equipment or an unexploded wartime bomb. Insurance investigators would examine the splintered timbers, measure the force required to crush the structure, and discover anomalies too vast to attribute to known vehicles. It is precisely in these moments, when trained professionals handle evidence, that the wizarding world's reliance on memory charms begins to appear absurd. No spell could consistently hide from forensic scrutiny the impressions left by toes the size of a car bonnet. The pretense that Muggles would simply accept extreme weather as an explanation fails to withstand even casual scrutiny. The books also leave ambiguous whether the giants ever attacked Muggle settlements deliberately or only when enraged. Given the giants' traditional hostility toward wizards, it seems implausible that they always remained disciplined. In Deathly Hallows, the giants are portrayed as nearly uncontrollable, smashing everything in their path during the Battle of Hogwarts. What magical coercion could possibly have forced them to tiptoe across the countryside without leaving the sort of scars visible from the air? During the early 1990s, Britain was covered by aerial photography and satellite surveillance. Even if no hikers or farmers reported the damage, the ministry would have had to interfere with defence reconnaissance, civil engineering surveys and meteorological satellites. Perhaps the most vivid mental image is that of a convoy of giants crossing the Pennines on a cold autumn night. Somewhere near Skipton, a lorry driver glances into a field and sees what looks like a prehistoric beast stooping to drink from a pond. The following morning, local newspapers might report enormous footprints. Television crews could be expected to arrive, interviewing pensioners who witnessed something impossible. And yet, in the wizarding world, such events vanish into the ether, never mentioned by Muggle authorities, never discussed even in the most sensational tabloids. It is a curious omission for a series so committed to the idea that the wizarding world must constantly conceal itself. Rowling's silence on this subject becomes more jarring when one considers how thoroughly the Muggle media cover other disasters. In Half-Blood Prince, a bridge collapse receives nationwide news coverage. The deaths of Amelia Bones and Emmeline Vance are framed as mysterious murders that baffle Scotland Yard. Yet when it comes to creatures of myth and folklore, creatures whose very existence contradicts the modern understanding of biology and physics, there is only emptiness. No rumours of giants circulate on late-night radio, no terrified hikers post anonymous letters to the press. Even the black market sellers of sensational stories seem to have missed what would surely have been the scoop of the century. Some might argue that the giants never left remote valleys, but the text repeatedly implies that Voldemort used them in active operations. Hagrid remarks they've been wreaking havoc wherever they go, suggesting that at least some attacks occurred outside the wizarding world's hidden enclaves. Moreover, the Ministry of Magic was in chaos after Scrimgeour's death. With the government collapsing and the Order of the Phoenix driven underground, it is difficult to believe that the enforcement of secrecy remained flawless. Even if Muggle witnesses were silenced, the physical destruction would have remained as mute testimony. There is, finally, the question of the wizarding world's arrogance. Throughout the series, wizards underestimate Muggles' curiosity and resilience. Arthur Weasley's fascination with electricity and Muggle artifacts underscores the gap in understanding. Wizards believe Muggles are too easily distracted to notice the impossible. But history shows that unexplained phenomena, especially on the scale of a giant's rampage, always leave a record. One has only to recall the Beast of Bodmin Moor, an ordinary big cat that fueled decades of folklore and investigation. How much more unforgettable would be the vision of an enormous humanoid, a living echo of Britain's most ancient legends, striding across the fells under a harvest moon. This absence of Muggle reaction becomes not just an inconsistency but a narrative vacuum, a place where the story's internal logic collapses. The giant's alliance with Voldemort was meant to raise the stakes, to show that he would stop at nothing to achieve domination. Yet it also reveals the limits of the statute of secrecy when confronted with creatures who cannot be hidden by mere illusions. The final battles could never have occurred in total darkness. Some farmer somewhere must have looked up from his tractor and seen the silhouette of Golgamath, the new Gurg, swinging a tree like a club. The fact that this vision never surfaces in the Muggle record is perhaps the greatest magic of all, an implausibility so vast it can only be called denial. Number 20. Magical pets in wizard homes. In the world J.K. Rowling created, one of the strangest gaps in the masquerade of secrecy is the question of magical creatures living practically under the noses of Muggles, yet going unnoticed. When Hagrid raised Norbert the Norwegian Ridgeback in his wooden hut on Hogwarts grounds, he did so with astonishing carelessness. The text itself describes a horrible noise coming from inside the hut that startled Harry, Hermione, and Ron. This dragon was a fire-breathing reptile growing fast enough to outgrow its crate within weeks. It belched smoke and sparked small fires. Yet Hogwarts lies within walking distance of Hogsmeade, and the castle grounds are described as visible from the nearby hills and valleys, part of the Scottish Highlands, where tourists and hikers roam. Even allowing for spells like Muggle-repelling charms, it is implausible that such a racket and smell would go forever unnoticed by an errant hiker on the wrong path. Consider Buckbeak the Hippogriff, another enormous creature Hagrid housed behind his pumpkin patch. Hippogriffs stand taller than a man and have massive, eagle-like wings capable of powerful beats of air. Rowling describes Buckbeak as a magnificent creature with great, powerful wings. Such a beast needs room to exercise. Even if Hogwarts grounds are protected, the boundaries are porous enough that Harry and Ron can crash the Ford Anglia into the Whomping Willow, or Hagrid can wander into the Forbidden Forest. If a hippogriff took flight, its silhouette would be plainly visible against the sky. There is no mention of spells that make flying beasts invisible to passing planes or hikers, and Hogwarts is ancient. Presumably even the Ministry must have worried once or twice about some keen-eyed Muggle mountaineer reporting the world's biggest bird of prey with a horse's hindquarters. Even more striking is Hagrid's penchant for breeding creatures in defiance of any regulations. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, he attempts to breed blast-ended Scroots. Rowling calls them horrible, pale creatures with stumpy legs and an explosive end, which spark and hiss and frequently blow themselves apart. She writes, "They are about 6 inches long and fairly harmless unless you count the sparks they were emitting at regular intervals. The older they grew, the larger and more violent they became, reportedly attacking each other and belching fire. They are loud, noxious, and prone to escaping. Yet no record exists of the Ministry purchasing land rights for what is effectively a monster breeding program on a school's property, nor of bribing local Muggles to hush the sounds of small explosions from the grounds. In Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Rowling doubles down on the idea that magical creatures are so exotic and unruly they need global regulation. Newt Scamander, author of the book Within the Wizarding World, devotes his life to tracking, cataloguing, and safely containing them. The Ministry has entire departments for classification of magical creatures, control of magical beasts, and regulation of magical species. Yet these bureaucracies seem absent. When it comes to the brazen activities of one gamekeeper on the Hogwarts grounds, if even the smallest village in Scotland might hear howling, roaring, or spot smoke from a breeding pit of Scroots, there is no mention of any consistent memory-charming program or hush-money fund to silence inquisitive locals. The Forbidden Forest itself is a magical bestiary that defies belief as a secret. It is home to centaurs who, unlike beasts, are intelligent and speak English. They have a fiercely independent culture, which Rowling shows when Bane, Megorian, and others discuss humans with disdain in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. They do not appreciate interference, and they have no interest in protecting wizard secrecy. Firenze the Centaur is even exiled for helping Dumbledore. It seems unlikely the Ministry could regularly obliviate an entire herd of resentful centaurs. If any Muggle wandered in by mistake, despite Muggle-repelling charms, the Ministry's cover-up effort would be immense and complicated, yet no such effort is depicted. Acromantulas also live in the Forbidden Forest. Rowling describes Aragog as the size of a small elephant with a clicking, chittering horde of offspring. These creatures speak, they hunt, they are not tame. Hagrid's pets once threatened to spread into the forest uncontrollably. Aragog even tells Harry, "I do not deny that my sons and daughters would have killed you." It is simply implausible that locals never noticed livestock vanishing, or strange, oversized webs in the trees, or heard chilling clicking noises on quiet Scottish nights. There is no record in the books of the Ministry buying out entire counties of forest land, nor of paying off farmers whose sheep were mysteriously devoured. Even magical law enforcement seems bizarrely negligent. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures is said to classify beasts into categories such as X to XXXX for danger. Blast-ended Scroots, Acromantulas, and dragons all rate near the top. Yet Hagrid merrily raises them at Hogwarts. The Ministry sends Charlie Weasley to Romania to handle dragons in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, showing they do care about dragon secrecy when it suits them. But Norbert was belching flames in a hut by the lake, and no official noticed until a schoolboy wrote to Charlie. There is no mention of an inspection. Team, magical zoning permits, or bribery budget to keep the locals quiet about the smell of singed wood or reptilian screeches on moonlit nights. Hogsmeade itself is a mixed case. The books say it is the only all-wizarding village in Britain, but it is not in a dome or sealed away. It is accessible by road, railway, and even by foot from nearby countryside. Muggle hikers could stumble upon it. Even if Muggle-repelling charms are in place, those charms fail or weaken, as they do with the Hogwarts Express crossing Muggle land. Wizards visit the Three Broomsticks or Zonko's joke shop with an easy familiarity that would attract tourists if not carefully guarded. How can they possibly host drunken wizard duels in the street or cart hippogriffs through the lanes without Muggle eyes. Noticing something is off? Rowling's universe also contains magical creatures too large or flamboyant to conceal easily. Thestrals pull the Hogwarts carriages, visible only to those who have seen death. For everyone else, the carriages appear to move on their own, but horses, even invisible ones, make sound and leave tracks. Anyone camping or farming nearby might see strange hoofprints in muddy paths leading toward the castle. There's no mention of the Ministry routinely obliviating nearby farmers who discover skeletal horse tracks by dawn. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Sirius Black in Animagus form hides in Hogsmeade as a large, shaggy dog. While this is plausible, it is the tip of the iceberg when we realize other animagi could take more conspicuous forms. Even registered animagi are rare and regulated, as we see with McGonagall's cat form being on record. But unregistered animagi like Sirius or Rita Skeeter show it's possible to flout these rules. If a wizard decided to become, say, a large magical creature via transfiguration or animagus training, he could cause havoc with little oversight, as the Ministry appears too preoccupied to police its own bestiary. The case of Newt Scamander's suitcase is even more revealing. His enchanted case houses entire biomes with creatures ranging from tiny stick insects to massive okumis that expand and contract to fill space. In Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, these creatures escape into New York City. Despite Scamander's efforts, they cause widespread destruction. Memory charms are required on dozens of witnesses and a massive operation is mounted to erase evidence. Compare this with Hogwarts, where Hagrid essentially has the same problem on a permanent basis. But there's no mention of large-scale obliviation squads patrolling the Scottish Highlands every week. Even the Ministry's official line on dangerous creatures seems contradictory. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, they ban dragons from the Quidditch World Cup campsite, rightly worried about Muggle witnesses. Yet they allow them at Hogwarts for the Triwizard Tournament, again trusting that Muggle-repelling charms will suffice for a creature that flies and breathes fire. The inconsistency is never explained, and no one suggests bribing local councils or covering up dragon sightings with weather balloons. Consider as well that Hogwarts itself is known in Muggle records as a ruin. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the narration says if anyone looked at it, all they'd see was a ruin with a sign warning them to keep out. But such a ruin would attract urban explorers, photographers, and teenagers on dares. These are precisely the people most likely to notice strange noises, roars, or lights flickering in the Forbidden Forest. Yet Rowling never discusses whether the Ministry funds constant monitoring or simply shrugs at the risk. It is easy to forget that Rowling's Britain is a modern country. Hagrid's hut would be on Google Maps by now. Tourists with drones might spot Buckbeak sunning himself. Rural Scotland is no longer uninhabited. Sheep farming, ecotourism, and wildlife conservation make any major forest area subject to human traffic. Magical secrecy would require ongoing coordination with local councils, bribery of landowners, and hush money for accidental witnesses. The books are silent about these logistical nightmares, suggesting either an implausible perfection of magical concealment or a striking negligence in wizard governance. Number 21. Magical shops and dark alleyways. Even in the carefully hidden wizarding world of Britain, the idea that entire streets of magical shops could sit in the heart of London without a single suspicious Muggle noticing strains credibility. J.K. Rowling describes Diagon Alley as accessed through the Leaky Cauldron, a tiny, grubby-looking pub camouflaged so well that, for a second, Harry wondered if he'd gone mad when Hagrid took him there. But London is a city of watchers, of nosy cabbies and street photographers, of columnists prowling for eccentric colour stories. The Leaky Cauldron's customers emerge with cauldrons, owls and pointed hats. Imagine them trickling out onto Charing Cross Road in clumps, robes billowing in the wind, then hurrying off toward the Tube. The very idea that no one ever stopped to call Scotland Yard about some weird cult meeting in that pub requires a peculiar complicity of the whole city, or else magic so thorough that it might be better described as collective mind control. Consider Borgin and Burke's in Nocturne Alley, a place even more outlandish than Diagon Alley. In Chamber of Secrets, Harry describes the shop as filled with evil-looking masks, a withered hand on a cushion, and cursed jewellery that can kill. The clientele here is even less subtle, hooded figures who trade in dark artefacts, arriving and departing through London streets. While Nocturne Alley is supposedly off Diagon Alley, the book suggests these districts are nestled somewhere in the old city, within walking distance of real Muggle spaces. Hagrid himself drags Harry back from Nocturne Alley into Diagon Alley with nothing more than a look of fury at anyone staring. Yet there is no mention of some startled Londoner stumbling in by mistake, no lost tourist ever wandering down the wrong turn, no tabloid with a screaming headline about satanic shop discovered in Soho. Even among wizard kind, there is recognition that these places are a little too accessible. Tom Riddle worked at Borgin and Burke's, recruiting dark objects and charming well-off customers like Hepzibah Smith, whose murder was hushed up. The wizards who frequent these shops do not all wear menacing hoods. Some are well-heeled society types who leave the alleys and re-enter the wider world. Lucius Malfoy, for instance, shops at Borgin and Burke's openly enough that Harry overhears him there while hiding in a cabinet. Lucius later threatens to slip a cursed object into a Hogwarts student's possessions. It is striking to think how close these transactions are to the real London. One door, one wall, a thin veil between black market curses and the Muggle shopping crowds at Piccadilly. There is a delicious but uncomfortable implication in Rowling's text that Muggles are simply too busy, too blind, too incurious to see the clues all around them. The books often suggest that wizards rely on Muggle self-absorption for secrecy. In Goblet of Fire, Arthur Weasley muses that Muggles see magic and think it's some newfangled cinema trick, but the detail of entire shopping districts built off London's main thoroughfares tests that explanation to its breaking point. It isn't just the presence of cauldrons and pointed hats. Wizards have a taste for the gothic, the grotesque, the flamboyant. Flourish and Blot sell spellbooks whose titles flicker and change. The apothecary reeks of potions ingredients. Harry notes barrels of slimy stuff and horns and fangs. How can that stench not drift onto the street? How can the foot traffic in and out of the leaky cauldron not attract a nosy landlord or a local council official who wonders about the fire code? It is not merely London that should notice. Hogwarts students pour into these shops every year, leaving in clusters with new pets and brooms. There is an economy built around this traffic. Aelop's Owl Emporium stocks owls for students whose families travel in from the countryside. Quality Quidditch supplies draws crowds to see the latest racing broom, the Firebolt, which Harry buys after seeing it in the window. The Firebolt itself is described as gleaming, with finely honed handle of ash and tail twigs made of birch. A product this expensive, this high profile, would be smuggled into Hogwarts on the Hogwarts Express and seen by every Muggle who happened to be at King's Cross that day. Harry, in fact, is stopped by Muggles who notice his cart, but they never seem to ask about the screaming trunk, the owl in a cage, or the enormous broom-shaped parcel he clutches with adolescent glee. Then there is the question of seasonal shopping. In Half-Blood Prince, the students visit Slug and Jigger's apothecary, where Harry notes barrels of slimy stuff stood on the floor, jars of herbs, dried roots and bright powders lined the walls. These goods are restocked regularly, delivered presumably by wizarding suppliers. Delivery carts must leave the alleys and cross London. Wizards might disapparate part of the way, but how do you disapparate barrels of slime through a Muggle sidewalk unnoticed? And even if you did, the wizard making the delivery surely emerges at some point on a real street. It beggars belief that no taxi driver has ever watched a man in green robes wrestle a crate that moaned and rattled. Even more telling is that the leaky cauldron is run by Tom, who is described as bald, toothless and grinning, and who greets a clientele that includes witches with parrots on their shoulders and goblins making snide remarks about Galleon. Rowling writes that the Muggles simply don't notice the pub. But how can they not notice the line of people in robes waiting outside? Even with a concealment charm on the door, the crowd would gather on the pavement, and inside the leaky cauldron there is an open fireplace used for flue travel. People tumble out in clouds of green flames. The idea that the landlord next door never complains about smoke damage seems almost satirical. London landlords can be counted on to raise hell over even the faintest smell of weed. And Diagon Alley is not the only magical shopping space. Hogsmeade Village is described as the only all-wizard settlement in Britain, yet it sits so near Muggle territory that Hogwarts students walk there on foot. Honeydukes, with its secret passage to the school, sells blood-flavoured lollipops and acid pops. Zonko's joke shop specialises in items that explode or scream, and yet these businesses must receive supplies, pay taxes, and employ staff. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry buys a monster book of monsters that bites. Packaging, shipping, and delivery of such items would leave traces in the Muggle world. A Muggle postal worker asked to handle a hissing parcel might well call the police. If even one of these shops employed a squib, a non-magical person born to wizarding parents, that employee could tell the whole world. In Order of the Phoenix, we meet Arabella Figg, a squib who lives on a Muggle street and reports on Harry for Dumbledore. She keeps her knowledge secret, but she does so because she is loyal, not because she is compelled. A less scrupulous squib might sell their story to the tabloids. Imagine the Daily Mail headline, "I cleaned a wizard pub for 20 years." And even among wizards, secrets leak. Mundungus Fletcher deals in stolen goods and constantly dodges ministry regulations. If someone like Mundungus has regular business in Knockturn Alley, how has he not drawn the attention of even one plainclothes detective or an undercover reporter? The magical community's secrecy is supposed to be maintained by the Ministry's Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, but their memory modification work must be constant and exhausting if wizards truly conduct all their shopping in London. In Goblet of Fire, when the Weasleys visit Harry at Privet Drive, they crash the fireplace and have to walk out onto the street in full wizard attire, prompting Mrs. Weasley to scold them about Muggles noticing. Arthur Weasley attempts to cover for them with vague excuses about a lawnmower malfunction. This scene is played for laughs, but it underscores the absurdity of the notion that the wizarding world can be so sloppy, yet so secret. The series also gives us glimpses of wizarding currency, galleons, sickles, knuts, which must be converted somewhere. Gringotts Bank sits in Diagon Alley, run by goblins who are not known for patience with Muggles. Yet in Philosopher's Stone, the goblins accept a letter from Dumbledore to withdraw Harry's trust fund. If wizards withdraw money in bulk to spend in the Muggle world, someone must launder those transactions. The idea that hundreds of wizarding families maintain a completely separate economy, yet shop in central London for cauldrons and unicorn horns without raising red flags at customs or revenue, and customs seems laughable. Moreover, there is evidence that magical concealment is not always reliable. In Prisoner of Azkaban, the night bus screeches through Muggle streets at impossible speeds, knocking over lampposts with Stan Shunpike cheerfully collecting fares. Harry sees Muggles gaping at the wreckage. The Ministry later repairs the damage and modifies memories, but it shows how thin the veil really is. If the night bus can be noticed, why not the steady stream of Hogwarts students carting bat spleens and newts through King's Cross Station in September? Ultimately, the explanation offered in the books is that Muggles see what they expect to see. In Goblet of Fire, Arthur Weasley says the Muggles will just think it's a stunt. But there is a difference between dismissing a single odd incident and ignoring the entire infrastructure of magical retail. Wizards leave physical traces, packaging waste, delivery receipts, shopping bags. They cannot disapparate large items, nor can they cast memory charms on everyone who ever sees a witch buy 12 cauldrons at once. The most charitable reading is that magic itself enforces a kind of cognitive dissonance, perhaps woven into the very fabric of London, but even that suggests a morally questionable manipulation of Muggle perception on a vast scale. It would mean every Londoner who ever wondered about that weird old pub on Charing Cross Road was subtly compelled to forget or dismiss their curiosity. Every council inspector, health official and beat cop who glanced at the leaky cauldron had their suspicions erased. In that sense, the wizarding world in Harry Potter is not just hidden, but enforcedly secret, a secrecy that can only be maintained by constant magical coercion. And so when we read about Harry buying a wand from Ollivander's, the narrowest shop in Diagon Alley with a peeling gold sign, or choosing an owl at Aelop's, or standing at Gringotts' marble counters while goblins count out galleons, we are also asked to imagine that not a single Muggle ever noticed, that no one followed the boy with the lightning scar from the leaky cauldron to the station, no one snapped his photo, no one questioned the clamour of this thriving hidden economy. It is a beautiful fantasy, but one that reveals how much wizards rely not just on magic, but on Muggle blindness, a blindness that may be the most powerful spell of all. Number 22, flying on broomsticks. The peculiar persistence of secrecy surrounding broomstick flights over Britain has always raised an unsettling question in the minds of observant readers. When Harry Potter first rode a broom at Hogwarts, soaring above the grounds with the wind lashing his face, the text described the sensation vividly. But when the older wizards travelled across real cities, the risk of detection multiplied exponentially. He mounted his broom and kicked off into the night, as J.K. Rowling wrote about Sirius Black's desperate escape across the rooftops. Those rooftops were not some secluded village lanes, but the outskirts of London, where floodlights glared over rail yards and train conductors leaned out of locomotive windows, squinting into the sky. The notion that hundreds of wizards travelling by broomstick in emergencies or for recreation could elude every magpie-eyed observer has never been convincingly explained by the Ministry's vague assurances about protective spells. Consider the case of Celestina Warbeck's 1992 concert in Birmingham. A crowd of witches and wizards converged on the venue late at night, arriving on broomsticks from all over the Midlands. The Daily Prophet coverage mentioned that auras were stationed along major routes to enforce secrecy, but even a half-awake lorry driver on the M6 motorway could have glanced upward and seen a ribbon of figures gliding across the clouds, some trailing enchanted banners to celebrate the singer's birthday. The Ministry's Department of Magical Transportation was supposedly responsible for diverting Muggle eyes, but no record has ever explained how they could interfere with civilian aircraft radar. Britain's airspace, crisscrossed with flight paths to Heathrow, Gatwick, and Birmingham International, bristles with monitoring systems designed to detect suspicious movement. It strains belief that not one traffic controller ever logged an unidentified flying object resembling a witch's broom. During the summer holidays of 1995, Madam Hooch was tasked with organising a training camp for Quidditch referees near Exeter. According to a leaked report in the Quibbler, dozens of ministry brooms took off at dusk to transport equipment, skirting the fringes of populated villages where street lamps cast yellow pools of light. That evening, several local farmers reported strange glimmers in the sky, but their stories were dismissed as rural imagination. Yet the wizarding authorities never admitted to conducting large-scale operations in the area. The official line remained that no magical air traffic was observed by Muggles, a statement repeated so often that it sounded less like reassurance and more like a charm itself. It invites the uneasy suspicion that the Obliviators were not merely on standby, but aggressively rewriting the memories of any witness, including airline crews, postal workers, and night shift security guards. It is also curious that no journalists from Muggle newspapers ever stumbled upon the broomstick flights. In the late 1980s, the London Evening Standard carried a rash of stories about UFO sightings over Surrey, including one witness who described a figure straddling a rod-shaped object. The ministry later claimed this was a misidentified weather balloon, A rather clumsy explanation considering that no meteorological service reported a launch that evening. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. If wizards were flying over towns, they were constantly relying on the incompetence or credulity of Muggles. One might argue that wizards used disillusionment charms to blend with the night sky, but such charms are imperfect. Moody, a veteran aura, demonstrated to Harry in Order of the Phoenix that disillusionment still caused a shimmering distortion like heat waves above a road. Anyone scanning the sky with binoculars or radar could have detected the movement. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, when Harry and Draco have their illicit broom race, they are within the enclosed Hogwarts grounds. Even then, Professor McGonagall is furious about the exposure risk. Yet in the same universe, Ministry officials think nothing of crossing half the country at altitude. The contrast is jarring. During the evacuation of Harry from Privet Drive in July 1997, no fewer than 7 broom-mounted Order members accompanied him. A dozen shapes on broomsticks were hurtling toward them, Rowling wrote. One of those broomsticks carried Tonks, whose bright pink hair glowed in the half-light. A pink-haired figure racing above London's ring roads would have made a surreal and unforgettable spectacle to anyone glancing up from a petrol station forecourt. More tellingly, the Ministry's own statements indicate that broom traffic was common. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Cornelius Fudge remarks on Sirius Black's supposed capabilities. He's not a fool. If he's flying, he'll stay well away from Muggles. This phrasing implies that broom flight across inhabited areas was frequent enough to require caution. The text suggests wizards knew how visible they were, and yet no. Records show Muggle pilots reporting any sightings to the Civil Aviation Authority. The simplest explanation is that the obliviators were constantly deployed to intercept these reports. But how could such a small department keep pace with every call to air traffic control, every curious amateur radio operator, and every journalist seeking a novelty headline? The Quidditch World Cup provides an even starker example. In 1994, tens of thousands of witches and wizards travelled to a single stadium in Devon. While most arrived by Portkey, many families were noted to prefer broomsticks. Ludo Bagman's own statements at the time referred to the exhilaration of a family flight. This suggests that hundreds of brooms streamed across the counties in the days before the match, Muggle airliners. Cruising toward Bristol or Cardiff would have passed close by. Even the most disciplined disillusionment would have struggled to conceal so many bodies in motion, especially when their robes flapped behind them in the summer wind. Equally strange is the way broomsticks must have appeared on radar screens. Modern civil aviation radar does not merely depend on transponders. It can detect the metal of an aircraft's body reflecting radio waves. Broomsticks, while partly wooden, are also studded with enchanted iron bands and bristle clamps. A radar technician scanning for small craft or drones would likely see a cluster of moving blips. The fact that no such radar logs have ever been produced suggests either a mass suppression of data or a systemic refusal to acknowledge unexplained returns. Neither explanation paints a flattering picture of Muggle authorities' vigilance. The wizarding community's reliance on secrecy seems more precarious than ever when you consider that broomsticks sometimes malfunction. In Quidditch, Through the Ages, Kennel-worthy Wisp describes the Comet 140 as prone to abrupt lurching. If a rider fell off over a suburban garden, the obliviators would have had to respond instantly. And yet no case of a dead wizard being found in a Muggle neighbourhood has been documented. It defies probability that every emergency was perfectly contained. The implication is that the Ministry uses magical detection spells of unimaginable reach, a surveillance power that would terrify Muggles if they ever guessed it existed. One cannot help but picture an exhausted obliviator trudging door to door along a terrace of semi-detached houses, erasing memories in the dead of night. Imagine an old woman peering from her attic window, seeing a cloaked figure tumbling from the sky, only to have the recollection whisked away before dawn. The humanity of that moment, the bewilderment, the fear, the compulsion to share it, vanishes into the void. The wizarding authorities might consider this a necessary sacrifice to preserve their world. Yet it suggests a casual disregard for the memories and agency of Muggle witnesses. Perhaps the most unsettling detail appears in Order of the Phoenix, when the advance guard collects Harry. They rise over Little Whinging, flying in formation. Tonks, Kingsley Shacklebolt and Lupin are all described as visible figures. The moon is shining, the air is clear. In a suburb with thousands of windows, it is implausible that no insomniac or shift worker noticed a squadron of wizards airborne. Even if no one called the police, the Ministry's risk calculations border on reckless. If wizard society has remained hidden despite all this, it may be because the Ministry exerts a control over Muggle perception so deep that even official archives and newsrooms are subtly corrupted. Each time a broomstick passes overhead, the evidence evaporates before it can form a coherent story. And so the memory of the witnesses, whether air traffic controller, night janitor, or taxi driver, is washed clean, leaving only an unease that something impossible had brushed against their lives. The fact remains that in a densely populated island nation, no protective enchantment is flawless. The disillusionment, charms shimmer, the brooms creak, the riders cough and call to one another. Somewhere, someone must have truly seen, but the wizarding world is built on the confident belief that the Muggle world will forget. Number 23, Muggle-born children in the Muggle world. Albus Dumbledore once said that the magical world existed hidden in plain sight, but there is something oddly suspicious about the idea that wizards could so perfectly conceal the eruptions of uncontrolled childhood magic in the middle of the Muggle world. Consider the theoretical existence of a special orphanage for magical children placed right in the heart of Muggle London, a crumbling Victorian building on the edge of a busy street, its sign reading St. Brigid's Home for Wayward Youth, the words faded and cracked with age. From the outside, the staff looked like any weary group of social workers, and the children seemed merely unruly and troubled. Yet behind that facade was something far stranger, a place where small witches and wizards, some from entirely Muggle families, accidentally set curtains ablaze when angered, sent chairs flying in the dining hall, or talked to rats in ways that unsettled the other children. Why didn't the Muggle world see? How could they possibly explain away the unexplained? One need only look at the records, hidden in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, to find the file of Eileen Carter, a 7-year-old with sharp green eyes who was placed in St. Brigid's after her Muggle parents died in a car crash. The records show that Eileen once made all the windows shatter simultaneously during a tantrum because she didn't want to eat porridge again. According to the caretaker's written testimony, the shards hovered in the air before falling harmlessly. A social worker named Mrs. Jensen, who was most certainly a Muggle, reportedly fainted on the spot, her memory later modified by an obliviator named Albert Peasgood. And yet, after all this, the home was not shut down, nor did the Muggle authorities investigate it beyond superficial welfare inspections. It remained open, and incidents kept happening, each one carefully covered up, memory by memory. It is worth remembering that Harry Potter himself is proof of the difficulty of hiding magical children among Muggles. The Dursleys could not have forgotten what they saw with their own eyes, as Vernon's face went purple in anger, while Petunia screeched about that awful boy making things happen, with no shame at all. J.K. Rowling writes in Philosopher's Stone, Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. Even before the Hogwarts letter arrived, strange events plagued the Dursley household. Harry's hair growing back overnight after a disastrous haircut, the jump onto the school roof to escape Dudley's gang, and the glass vanishing at the zoo to free the boa constrictor. These were isolated events in one house, but if that was the case with one child in one suburb, what must it have been like in an entire orphanage filled with magical children? One cannot simply assume that the Ministry of Magic had unlimited manpower to perform daily memory charms on every neighbour, postman, milkman, school inspector, or curious relative who might ask too many questions. The thought that a group of wizards from the Obliviator Squad could systematically patrol Muggle social services and welfare departments to erase all suspicion stretches believability. Imagine the file of young Thomas Shingle, age 6, who once made all the cutlery in the St. Bridget's kitchen dance the polka on the tiled floor while a horrified volunteer screamed and dropped the soup tureen. She was sent home for nerves, never to return. Thomas's file is thick with memory charm signatures, each a bureaucratic record of Muggle awareness forcibly snuffed out. Rowling's world suggests that the statute of secrecy is maintained at all costs, yet there is a coldness to the idea that memory charms could be used so liberally, so permanently, without ethical consideration. The caretakers at St. Bridget's may have had memories altered dozens of times, never understanding why they felt such dread in the halls or had recurring dreams about fire. It would have been an exhausting, endless cycle. At some point, one of them surely would have kept a diary recording the inconsistencies, a repeated Groundhog Day of unexplained phenomena and lost time. One might picture Mr. Collins, the night porter, finding notes in his own handwriting that made no sense. Thursday, she levitated again. Friday, who is she? Such notes would have to be confiscated or destroyed by ministry agents before they could be discovered in any investigation. Even more damning is the question of school inspections. Muggle authorities did not simply ignore institutions for vulnerable children. A government inspector named Miss Hargrave once visited St. Bridget's in 1982, according to the ministry's own files. She noted children with unusual behavioral disorders, describing one girl who would shriek and cause the air to buzz with static, frightening the other children. The report was removed from Muggle archives by the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office, along with Miss Hargrave's own memories of the entire visit. "I'm not stupid, Arthur," she is recorded saying before being obliviated. "I know what I saw." Yet the record ends with a note from Mafalda Hopkirk. Memory charm successful. Subject pacified. How many times did this happen? How many professionals were simply made to forget they ever cared? It seems absurd to imagine that neighbours never heard the shrieks and crashes, that no one ever saw a burst of green or blue sparks through the windows, that the local constable didn't visit after reports of strange lights or shouting. It is easy to picture a beat cop named Sergeant Barnes stopping outside the orphanage gates, noticing the front door burst open on its own, and writing in his notebook before a friendly obliviator redirected him and erased the ink with a flick of his wand. Such incidents would accumulate. A Muggle neighbourhood would have rumours. "That place is haunted, and don't go near it at night. I heard they lock the children up." The secrecy would be half maintained by ministry intervention and half by Muggle fear. Yet even if fear played its part, the Muggle world is not a monolith of credulous fools. Journalists investigate. Consider the Evening Standard Dispatch of 1977 that wrote of mysterious fires at a children's home before the paper was quietly bought up by a wizard family and the article killed. A draft of the story survives in a ministry evidence locker describing bedsheets spontaneously combusting, frightened children reporting nightmares of giant snakes, and an unconfirmed report of a caretaker quitting after seeing one girl's eyes glow red in the dark. The journalist Philip Bracken received a payout and an extended vacation in Australia after being obliviated so thoroughly that he forgot he had a family in London at all. Even for the wizarding world, this is a staggering moral price to keep magic secret. One wonders what the children themselves remembered. Harry remembered everything. He remembered the cupboard, the insults, the fear. Wouldn't the children in St. Bridget's remember too? How did the ministry handle them before Hogwarts? The older ones might have been told they were simply mad, the word itself a tool of suppression. Maybe a boy like Joseph Barker, who once made all the lights in the building explode when he was bullied, sat in a locked room for days while the staff tried to figure out what was wrong with him. Perhaps they called in psychiatrists, only for those experts' memories to be modified as well. The children might have been told they were liars, punished for things they barely understood. And what of the children who never received a Hogwarts letter, the squibs? They had magic in them once, strange, uncontrolled surges in childhood, before it faded away or was suppressed. Did they forget? Or did they grow up with unexplained trauma? Arabella Figg remembered. She could see Dementors. She knew enough of magic to help Harry, but she lived her life in the Muggle world, halfway in, halfway out. How many others like her existed, living with memories of a place where they were told they were crazy for making toys fly or talking to crows in human speech? How many never received any guidance at all? The Ministry's policy was never charity, it was containment. Rolling notes in Order of the Phoenix that the Obliviator Squad is a routine branch of government. Accidental Magic Reversal Squad sounds almost comical until you imagine them standing in a children's ward, erasing a nurse's mind after a girl made all the IV tubes knot themselves into snakes. The reality is horrific. There is no indication that the Ministry offered counselling to the affected Muggles. They simply removed the knowledge and let them deal with the confusion. The moral toll is invisible in the books, but implied if one reads closely enough. Such institutional secrecy would require a culture of fear and silence among wizards. Adults like Arthur Weasley might oppose it privately, but the law is clear. The statute of secrecy is paramount. Even compassionate witches and wizards would find themselves complicit. Imagine a young trainee obliviator, sickened after erasing the same social worker's memories for the 10th time, being told it's for the greater good. This is the dark undercurrent in Rowling's world that often goes unspoken, but lurks behind every cheerful trip to Diagon Alley. Harry's own story reveals the Ministry's casual cruelty. They let him suffer with the Dursleys, never intervening, despite knowing he was mistreated. If they let that happen to the boy who lived, one can only imagine how they treated nameless children in places like St. Bridget's. The logic was always that secrecy mattered more than individual welfare. Petunia knew magic was real, but was never obliviated. That suggests they made selective choices, deciding who was too dangerous to know, and who could be allowed to remember in bitterness and fear, like a warning to others. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the wizarding world relied on Muggle willingness to forget, that they counted on social stigma, on overworked bureaucrats, on the dismissive attitude toward troubled children, that they knew most people would look away rather than face something inexplicable. The statute of secrecy, in the end, was maintained not just by magic, but by a very human failing, the ease with which people can be persuaded not to see at all. Number 24, the Forbidden Forest and Magical Creatures. In the dark shadow of Hogwarts Castle sprawls the Forbidden Forest, a vast and ancient woodland teeming with creatures no sane person would call benign. J.K. Rowling's books make it clear this is no mere copse of pines. It is home to acromantulas the size of elephants, fiercely intelligent centaurs, unicorn herds, and, on occasion, fully grown trolls. It is so large that it appears to stretch for miles, its boundaries bleeding into the rolling Scottish countryside. And yet, oddly enough, not a single Muggle hiker ever reports spotting a giant spider weaving a web across a clearing or a herd of centaurs debating under the moonlight. We're asked to accept that the entire area is effectively invisible to non-magical eyes. The question is, how believable is that really, given what we know about the world Rowling created? There is no denying that the forest is meant to be dangerous, even to wizards. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid warns the forest is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death. This is not hyperbole. Acromantulas, as we learn from Aragog in Chamber of Secrets, will kill and eat any human who enters, wizard or not. That alone would seem enough to raise alarm if Muggle farmers nearby heard blood-curdling shrieks or found partially devoured carcasses at the edge of their grazing lands. The fact that this never happens in the books suggests powerful magical concealment. perhaps too powerful, straining even the flexible internal logic of the wizarding world. Rowling does acknowledge the statute of secrecy under which wizards have hidden magical creatures from Muggles for centuries. Spells like the Muggle-repelling charm are canon. Yet these charms tend to discourage casual visitors rather than rendering entire regions acoustically and visually undetectable. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione venture into the Forbidden Forest in Philosopher's Stone, they hear werewolf-like howls, see dead unicorns, and encounter centaurs who fire arrows at anything that moves. Imagine a Muggle forester with a good set of ears camping on a nearby hill. Wouldn't he hear that eerie howling? Wouldn't the local police get a report of strange lights, movement, or monstrous roars in the woods? Even more puzzling is the sheer size of the creatures. Aragog alone is described as the size of a small elephant in Chamber of Secrets. His colony numbers in the dozens, possibly hundreds. They are not subtle predators. When Harry and Ron stumble upon them, they hear clicking and rustling all around them as countless giant spiders close in. How does the Ministry of Magic maintain such an extensive concealment field? Is every acromantula charmed individually? Does the forest itself repel Muggles with an impenetrable veil? The books don't say. We are simply told to accept that no one wanders in and no one sees anything. Consider also that the Forbidden Forest borders Hogwarts grounds, which are described as being vast but not infinite. At the very least, the school lies in Britain, where land is heavily parcelled, owned and surveyed. Maps, satellite photography, hikers with GPS trackers, all these exist even in the wizarding timeline, especially in the 1990s. Yet the series implies that Muggles see nothing suspicious. They don't notice hundreds of acres of impenetrable forest where no gamekeeper from the local estate ever ventures. It is left to readers to infer that the Ministry maintains a permanent cover-up. But this is a forest so noisy, violent, and creature-rich that even perfect illusions would be stretched to their limit. A telling moment in Goblet of Fire deepens the question. During the Quidditch World Cup, the Ministry scrambles to hide magical creatures and phenomena from Muggles, even using memory charms on witnesses. Barty Crouch Sr. instructs his staff to modify as many memories as necessary when Death Eaters begin terrorizing Muggle campsite owners. Clearly, the Ministry is not confident that illusions alone will prevent exposure. It must actively intervene. Yet the Forbidden Forest, arguably even more chaotic than a Death Eater attack, is never shown to require this level of cleanup. That's hard to square with the danger and the noise implied in scenes like when Grawp, Hagrid's giant half-brother, tears through the undergrowth in Order of the Phoenix, leaving trees splintered like matchsticks. In Order of the Phoenix, there's an entire subplot about centaurs growing hostile and territorial. They threaten to kill Dolores Umbridge and react violently to any human trespass. Their society is intelligent, organized, and presumably noisy in their civil disputes and rituals. Rowling describes the encounter with Umbridge in detail. The centaurs shouted, screamed, and reared, their hooves pounding the earth. Is the sound of a centaur cavalry charge really muffled by a charm? What about the shouting, or the magic they themselves can perform? Centaurs are shown using bows, launching arrows with deadly accuracy, dangerous enough for any nearby Muggle to notice if he wandered within earshot. Then there's the question of trolls. In Philosopher's Stone, a mountain troll smashes its way through Hogwarts itself, and in Goblet of Fire, we're told they are used as security at the Triwizard Tournament. Trolls are not subtle. Their roars are described as deafening. Hagrid even suggests in Prisoner of Azkaban that the forest can hold trolls at all. How does anyone keep an enormous, roaring troll concealed from the mundane world? Even if repelling charms turn Muggles around, the sounds of battle or roaring must travel. Britain's countryside is not that uninhabited, even in Rowling's romantic depiction. One might argue that Rowling offers an out in the form of the Hogwarts enchantments themselves. In Goblet of Fire, Hermione says, Hogwarts has spells on it to stop people finding it. We can infer that the forest benefits from similar protections. But does that extend to silencing all noise, hiding all heat signatures, making entire herds of unicorns invisible to infrared photography? It's never specified. And given that the statute of secrecy is so often broken elsewhere, like when Harry blows up Aunt Marge or when the night bus screeches through London traffic, it seems unlikely wizards are so thorough here. The forest is simply too big, too wild and too populated with things that don't hide well. A particularly vivid example comes in Chamber of Secrets when Harry and Ron follow the spiders to Aragog's lair. The path is described as overgrown but clear enough to follow. The acromantulas dropped on threads of silk as thick as rope, and the trees are covered in webs like domes of gauze. It is the sort of grotesque spectacle that would be nearly impossible to disguise at scale. Even if the forest is charmed, what happens when wind blows these silk ropes into neighbouring fields? Would farmers not notice? Would local authorities not investigate rumours of webs the size of parachutes snagged in trees at the edge of their properties? Moreover, the forest is not static. Its residents move. Grawp is not exactly confined. When Harry visits him, he's tied between trees that strain to hold him. Hagrid mentions having to subdue him regularly. How does the Ministry manage to keep a 16-foot giant from wandering out of range? Is there a legion of obliviators on constant duty? Or do the spells work so perfectly that even if Grawp thundered into a Muggle village, they would see nothing? The text offers no satisfying answer, only the assumption that it just works. And what about the centaur's arrows? They are described as expert bowmen, able to target with uncanny precision, even in darkness. Do Muggles who find a silver-tipped arrow on the forest outskirts simply forget what they saw? Or does the Ministry sweep the perimeter daily to collect stray projectiles? Given how many times students, particularly Harry and his friends, breach school rules to visit the forest, it's hard to believe no one ever notices these signs. Rowling's narrative prefers to keep the Muggle world conveniently blind, but that blindness becomes harder to justify the more the forest's detail is expanded. Hogwarts itself is hidden by illusions that make it appear to be a ruin with a sign warning of danger, but the forest has no such sign. Hagrid himself says that centaurs consider it their territory, not Hogwarts. This implies there are no wizarding guards at its borders. Hagrid patrols the forest, yes, but as a lone gamekeeper, he's clearly overmatched by its inhabitants. So who enforces the statute of secrecy when a giant spider colony decides to spread toward nearby farmland? Is there a task force of Ministry wizards constantly patrolling the entire perimeter? Again, the books never say. It is also strange that magical creatures with their own intelligence are content to stay hidden. The centaurs actively resent wizards, seeing themselves as above them. Why do they accept living in enforced secrecy? In Order of the Phoenix, they speak of human arrogance with disgust. Why would they cooperate with the Ministry's need to keep Muggles unaware? If they have any freedom at all, they might be expected to roam, explore, or even retaliate against nearby human encroachment. Ultimately, the Forbidden Forest functions as a narrative device, a boundary marker for danger, a source of Gothic atmosphere, and a space for moral lessons about fear and respect. But its practicality within Rowling's world is murky. The wizarding community is shown to be constantly on the edge of exposure. They scramble to hide dragons in Goblet of Fire, hush up a giant snake in the Chamber of Secrets, and memory charm entire towns after Dementor attacks. Yet the most obvious breach of secrecy, a giant monster-infested forest next to a school, goes unremarked. It is as if Rowling hopes readers will simply be too enchanted to notice. Number 25. Sirius Black's Arrest and Disguise. When Sirius Black slipped through the iron bars of Azkaban and vanished into the misty dawn, the wizarding world erupted into tremors of fear. His gaunt face, hollowed by 12 years of despair and the soul-sapping presence of Dementors, glared from every magical newspaper. The Daily Prophet printed the same grim photograph, Sirius with tangled black hair, and a look of maniacal triumph, as if repetition alone would keep the public vigilant. Yet, what no witch or wizard dared to consider was that London itself was a teeming labyrinth of Muggle eyes, each street crawling with cameras and constables who knew nothing of Dementors or enchanted prisons. As Sirius crouched in filthy alleyways and scavenged scraps from bins, he remained uncaught for months, a phantom in plain sight, and this improbable invisibility exposes one of the strangest fractures between the magical and non-magical worlds. Imagine the early autumn of 1993, when every underground station, every crowded bus, every neon-lit pub bristled with Muggles glued to television screens. The police were on high alert, with news bulletins warning of murderers, missing children, and escaped convicts. It seems unthinkable that none of them glimpsed a tall, skeletal vagrant with piercing grey eyes who matched the wanted posters in wizarding shops. Even wizards acknowledged his notoriety. Cornelius Fudge, then Minister for Magic, admitted in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban that Black's face is known to every witch and wizard, and yet the millions of Muggles who should have been most exposed to him carried on oblivious, as if some collective blindness had settled over London. The Ministry of Magic often boasted about its capacity to modify memories. When the night bus delivered Harry Potter to the leaky cauldron after his own brief flight from Privet Drive, Fudge assured Harry that Muggles never notice anything. This refrain, almost smug in its repetition, underscores how the wizarding authorities dismissed the scale of the Muggle world's surveillance. It is one thing to obliviate the mind of a single witness who happened upon a misfired hex. But in the 1990s, London was already blanketed with CCTV, each black glass orb recording the comings and goings of every pedestrian. Did the Ministry dispatch squads of aurors every evening to slip into the Metropolitan Police's evidence rooms and erase tapes? Or did they prefer to trust in the wizard's habitual arrogance, confident that a ragged dog animagus could prowl the streets unseen? Consider the case of Arabella Figg, the squib neighbour who spied on Harry for Dumbledore. Her very existence proves that wizards understood how to blend into Muggle suburbs. Sirius, by contrast, made little effort to disguise his striking features when not transformed. In his human form he wore rags, but he could not alter the haunted gauntness of his face or the shadows under his eyes. Children playing in parks, constables patrolling deserted alleys, charity workers handing out sandwiches, anyone of them might have looked twice. And yet the record is silent. No mention exists in Muggle newspapers of a mad vagrant matching the precise description circulated by wizarding authorities. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Fudge insisted to the Dursleys that Sirius was a murderous, raving lunatic who would do anything to reach Harry. This should have made the Ministry's caution absolute. Surely they would have anticipated that even the dimmest Muggle might connect the dots. A dangerous fugitive with a distinctive appearance, known to be in London. Yet the Muggle press made no mention of this lurking figure, and not a single police report survives describing encounters with him. The wizarding world's faith in secrecy was either astonishingly naive or underpinned by an unspoken mechanism of mass concealment. Some might argue that Sirius spent most of his time transformed into his animagus shape, the enormous black dog that Harry later named Padfoot. This is partly true, but not entirely. The book recounts how Sirius broke into Gryffindor Tower more than once in human form, wielded a knife, and stood over Ron Weasley's bed. He was capable of navigating the streets as a man, gaunt and dishevelled, but undeniably human. When he boarded the train to Hogwarts, he must have passed through crowded platforms. Not every moment could have been spent on four legs. If Muggle London were as watchful as it claimed to be, Sirius should have been cornered by curious officers or at least followed by an inquisitive social worker. One detail rarely discussed is the intersection of Sirius's wanderings with Muggle institutions. At King's Cross Station, hundreds of passengers flowed around him as he passed the barrier to platform 9 3/4. No Auror can have been present at every hour. It is implausible that the Ministry monitored the station continuously. Even in wizarding attire, Sirius might have stood out. In Muggle terms, he was a vagrant in a major transport hub, likely to attract the scrutiny of transit police. Yet again, nothing is recorded. The Ministry's secrecy seemed less like a cunning plan and more like a collective shrug, as if wizards believed Muggles would simply fail to perceive the extraordinary. Some wizards, like Arthur Weasley, genuinely respected the ingenuity of Muggles, especially their knack for inventing devices to record and protect their world. Arthur's fascination with eccentricity and batteries betrayed an understanding that Muggles were not hopelessly blind. He would have known that an escaped convict could be seen, photographed, and identified by Muggle authorities. Yet Arthur never raised this possibility, nor did Dumbledore. Even Remus Lupin, Sirius's oldest friend, seems to have assumed that Muggles posed no threat to the fugitive's freedom. This complacency, so pervasive among magical folk, was perhaps the very reason Sirius roamed the capital unchallenged. The question grows sharper when one remembers that Sirius was not just any vagrant but the supposed betrayer of James and Lily Potter. His story was soaked in infamy. If any Muggle constable had seen the resemblance between this gaunt stranger and the face on the prophet's moving photographs, it might have triggered an inquiry. The idea that no such moment ever occurred strains belief. Perhaps the wizarding authorities quietly altered the memories of a few unlucky bystanders, but the sheer number of potential witnesses makes the task nearly impossible. One can obliviate a shopkeeper or a bus driver, but not an entire city, not every camera and every archive. The strangeness intensifies when you recall how quickly the Ministry acted to conceal magical mishaps far less consequential than Sirius Black. When Harry inflated Aunt Marge, the improper use of Magic Office sent a howler within hours. When a rogue bludger attacked Harry on the Quidditch pitch, Madam Hooch intervened in seconds. Yet a fugitive with a murderous reputation, prowling the alleys of London for months, apparently never warranted similar urgency. The inconsistency is striking, a testament to either astonishing incompetence or a conspiracy so thorough that the truth remains hidden. More than any other episode in the saga, Sirius's unnoticed presence among Muggles exposes the fragile nature of the Statute of Secrecy. Wizards often congratulated themselves that the statute had never been breached in modern times, but here was a case in which its collapse seemed inevitable. Imagine the front page of the Evening Standard if a constable had photographed Sirius in a police station. Gaunt vagrant or escaped killer? It would have unleashed a storm of questions no memory charm could erase completely, and yet no such revelation ever came. The sense of unreality deepens when you consider that Sirius was hunting Peter Pettigrew, who masqueraded as a rat. In a city of millions, this chase was more than improbable. It was absurdly theatrical. A man disguised as a dog, stalking a traitor disguised as a rodent, all beneath the oblivious gaze of Muggle Londoners who never noticed the shadows at their feet. This is not simply a quirk of the narrative. It is a crack in the wall separating two worlds that should, by all reason, have collided. If anything, Sirius's flight should have been the catalyst for a Muggle wizarding crisis. It demonstrated that magic was not an impregnable curtain, but a thin gauze, easily pierced by curiosity, technology, or chance. The fact that it never happened suggests that the Ministry either exercised a power far greater than it admitted, or that the Muggles themselves, confronted with something too strange to classify, chose to look away. This perhaps is the most unsettling possibility of all, that people saw the truth but buried it under disbelief. When you study this episode closely, you are left with an impression of profound contradiction. A fugitive too famous to hide in a city too crowded to vanish, nonetheless melted into the shadows without a trace. Even the most charitable interpretation implies that the wizarding world was playing with a kind of fire it could not truly control. The arrest of Sirius Black, or rather the long failure to arrest him, remains a testament to how precarious the masquerade always was, and how little it might take to shatter it forever. Number 26. Millennium Bridge Collapse. The Millennium Bridge, an elegant steel structure spanning the Thames, collapsed into the water under the grey English sky in a cinematic spectacle that the Muggle world, by all logic, could not have ignored. Twisting cables and groaning girders snapped in a surge of magical violence, sending dozens of pedestrians plummeting into the river below, while Death Eaters, trailing black smoke like harbingers of some ancient plague, swept through the London skyline. It was not a discreet incident hidden in a remote alleyway, or veiled by the subtle charms Arthur Weasley once described with paternal fondness. Instead, this event unfolded at the very heart of the city, in full view of office workers staring from glass towers, commuters whose mobile phones were surely raised to record the horror, and tourists who had come to photograph one of London's modern landmarks. That single moment laid bare the absurd tension in the wizarding world's insistence that Muggles remain oblivious. No matter how powerful Obliviators might be, the Ministry of Magic could not reasonably hope to hush up a catastrophe that the BBC, Sky News, and countless amateur eyewitnesses would have broadcast within minutes. If one pauses to consider this event alongside the canonical timeline, the contradiction becomes even more striking. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling chose to depict the collapse of a different bridge, the Brockdale Bridge, and crucially, she included lines that demonstrated how the Muggle Prime Minister was fully aware of the attacks. The Prime Minister had been warned by Cornelius Fudge about the threat to Muggle infrastructure and was informed that the wizarding world was engaged in an escalating conflict with Voldemort. "It's been a disaster," Fudge admitted grimly in the book, acknowledging that the public explanation, high winds, was absurd but necessary. If that fictional government was already struggling to explain collapses in less conspicuous places, how could any rational observer believe that the Millennium Bridge's destruction could be dismissed without a colossal scandal? The Death Eaters' rampage across London was not a subtle infiltration, but an overt act of terror. As Bellatrix Lestrange laughed amid swirling flames, and Fenrir Greyback leapt from rooftop to rooftop, their presence was recorded by every CCTV camera aimed along the embankment and beyond. If the Ministry truly intended to erase the memories of thousands of onlookers, it would have required an unprecedented deployment of memory charms. Even the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes would have struggled to identify and track every person who witnessed the event, let alone wipe the footage that surely existed on private devices and media servers. The question remains whether any magic, however potent, could have suppressed the collective memory of a modern metropolis. One must wonder if there were Muggle survivors haunted by recollections they could not articulate. A bridge that buckled without reason, shadows that flew overhead, the chill of terror that no rational explanation could erase. The film adaptation of the bridge collapse added a layer of visual grandeur that eclipsed the book's more cautious narrative. Yet this spectacle exposed a fundamental problem in the wizarding world's masquerade. When Voldemort returned in the flesh, Dumbledore himself had insisted that hiding was no longer an option. He told Fudge in the Ministry atrium, "You are blinded by the love of the office you hold, Cornelius," and called for honesty. But in the film's reality, the Ministry appeared committed to the same brittle pretense. One can imagine Rufus Scrimgeour convening emergency meetings with Muggle officials, offering half-truths and magical contracts, and perhaps even deploying legions of Obliviators to suppress the panic. Yet even this scenario strains credibility. Would the entire British cabinet meekly submit to wizards in plum-coloured robes waving wands to adjust memories? Consider the very real political and logistical consequences such an attack would have triggered. Hundreds of families would have demanded inquiries. Structural engineers and police investigators would have scoured the wreckage, searching for the cause. Insurance companies would have launched legal challenges. The newspapers would have printed headlines in the largest possible typeface, while talk shows speculated about terrorism, sabotage, or divine wrath. And every step of this public scrutiny would have forced the Ministry to escalate its cover-up. The sheer scale of damage, the bridge sheared in two, pedestrians injured or drowned, exceeded any previous breaches of secrecy described in canon. Even in the chaotic aftermath of the Quidditch World Cup, when Death Eaters torched Muggle tents, the victims were only a few campers. Here, the entire city had been attacked. The scene also raises questions about the ethics and sustainability of the Statute of Secrecy itself. For centuries, wizards had insisted their hidden society protected both magical and non-magical people from persecution and panic. But this moment revealed that the statute had become a shield, not only for protection, but also for denial. By the time the Millennium Bridge splashed into the river, Voldemort's followers had made clear that they would no longer distinguish between Muggle and wizarding targets. The attack was a message. Nowhere was safe, and no government, magical or Muggle, could contain them. The refusal to acknowledge this publicly only deepened the chasm between worlds, a chasm that Dumbledore in the books had pleaded to bridge. Throughout Rowling's text, there are glimpses of this tension, the hidden costs of wizarding secrecy. In Goblet of Fire, Arthur Weasley confessed to Harry that even simple magical accidents were difficult to hide. Muggles notice, he said. They notice if you're using magic in front of them. Yet, here was not a single stray hex, but a catastrophic attack on national infrastructure. No disillusionment charm could have prevented Muggles from seeing a bridge splinter apart like matchsticks. No Confundus charm could have erased the evidence from thousands of cameras. And if the Ministry did attempt such an erasure, it would have amounted to a mass manipulation of public consciousness, a moral transgression that Dumbledore, with all his caution, would have opposed. One must also consider the psychological toll on the Muggle population. In the books, even a brief glimpse of a Dementor left people shivering, haunted by depression. Imagine thousands of Londoners simultaneously exposed to the malevolent presence of Death Eaters, their memories fractured and rewritten in haste. The Ministry might have congratulated itself on preserving secrecy, but the victims would have carried invisible scars. Perhaps some awoke at night with half-formed recollections of screaming and darkness. Perhaps a few refused to believe the official statements, convinced they had seen black-robed figures streaking across the skyline. The wizarding world's illusions would have remained intact, but only by wounding the minds of an entire city. While the books described the Statute of Secrecy as the cornerstone of magical society, the Millennium Bridge scene shows its limits. There was no possible way to square the magnitude of the attack with the idea that the Muggle world could remain ignorant. The destruction was not a localized event hidden from view. It was an assault on a beloved landmark witnessed by thousands, with consequences echoing through the media, politics, and collective memory of Britain. Even if one assumes the Ministry deployed every available obliviator, the question persists. How many people slipped through the cracks? How many kept fragments of truth locked behind confused memories, waiting for a moment to surface? In Rowling's text, Harry's own experience with the media, the Daily Prophet's smear campaigns, Rita Skeeter's exposés, shows how quickly information can spread, even in a magical context. So what would have stopped Muggle journalists from uncovering inconsistencies in the official explanations? What would have prevented whistleblowers in the Ministry from leaking the truth? The entire masquerade depended on the unlikely premise that every single witness could be silenced or convinced to doubt their senses. The Millennium Bridge's fall transformed the Statute of Secrecy from a pragmatic compromise into a dangerous delusion. Some might argue that the films embraced spectacle over plausibility, and they would be right. The image of the bridge collapsing in slow motion, of Death Eaters swirling like carrion crows, is unforgettable. Yet by choosing to include it, the adaptation posed a question the narrative could never resolve. How can any society, magical or not, remain invisible in the age of modern surveillance? In the end, the bridge's destruction was not only a declaration of war by Voldemort, but also an unintentional confession. The wizarding world could no longer pretend that it operated in a separate sphere, immune from Muggle notice. Magic, once hidden behind centuries of caution, had erupted into plain sight. The Millennium Bridge became the emblem of a war that no Obliviator squad could truly erase. It proved that secrecy was a fragile enchantment, a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution. And it suggested that perhaps when Dumbledore pleaded for unity and honesty, he understood the truth more deeply than any Ministry official, that the Age of Shadows was ending and no charm could hold back the dawn.